I adjusted my cufflinks by instinct as I stood near the edge of the conference hall, watching the crowd the way you do when you've spent a lifetime reading rooms before speaking in them. The annual technology summit had always been loud, self-important, and vaguely exhausting, but this year felt different. The lights were brighter. The conversations felt sharper. Or maybe that was just me noticing things more clearly now that I wasn't inside the system anymore. I'd stepped away from my role as Chief Compliance Officer 2 years earlier, after nearly 4 decades in corporate risk management. Long enough to see cycles repeat. Long enough to know that when something feels off, it usually is. Still, I'd come at the invitation of an old board member, partly out of courtesy, partly out of curiosity. Retirement gives you time, but it also gives you distance, and distance has a way of sharpening instincts you once had to suppress. I was reaching for a glass of water when I felt a hand brush my sleeve. Not grab. Not tug. Just enough pressure to get my attention without drawing eyes. Don't turn around, a voice said quietly. Familiar. Tighter than I remembered. Just listen. I froze, outwardly calm, inwardly alert. Michael? I murmured. Yeah. It's me. A pause. He's been watching you. My old colleague Michael Reyes had been my deputy for nearly 10 years. Brilliant, meticulous, painfully honest in a field that rewarded flexibility with the truth. I hadn't seen him since my retirement dinner. The fact that he'd approached me like this told me more than his words did. Who? I asked. The man near the back. Gray jacket. No badge. He's been following you since the morning keynote. Not subtle enough to be security. Too careful to be random. I resisted the urge to scan the room. Years of interviews, negotiations, and regulatory hearings had trained me well. Panic is a signal. Control is camouflage. Walk with me, Michael said. Toward the terrace. We moved slowly through the crowd, 2 old professionals chatting about nothing, our bodies angled just enough that I could see reflections in glass and polished surfaces. The man stood exactly where Michael said he would be. Mid-40s. Clean cut. Expensive watch worn casually, the way people do when they want it noticed without looking like they want it noticed. His eyes weren't on me directly. They didn't need to be. He was using his phone as a mirror. Outside, the noise softened into a distant hum. The city stretched below us, late afternoon light catching on steel and glass. Michael exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath since morning. Tell me everything, I said. I first noticed him 3 days ago, Michael replied. Not here. At the offices. My stomach tightened. Which offices? Yours. The consulting firm. He was sitting across the street. Took photos. Made a few calls. When I went out to get a better look, he left. I said nothing. There's more, Michael continued. I did some asking. Quietly. He's not private security. Not law enforcement. He's a contractor. Works through intermediaries. Hired muscle? I asked. More like hired eyes. I turned to him then. By whom? Michael hesitated. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about a competitor or a random threat. By someone who knows you, he said. Someone with access. The conference suddenly felt very far away. After we parted, I stayed on the terrace longer than necessary, replaying the last few months in my head. Retirement had been peaceful, at least on the surface. I'd started a small advisory firm, mostly pro bono work, helping whistleblowers navigate disclosures without destroying their lives. I chose cases carefully. Or so I thought. There had been odd moments. A misdirected email that felt too specific to be accidental. A neighbor mentioning someone had asked about my schedule. A sense, hard to articulate, that my routines were no longer entirely my own. That night, I didn't go home. I checked into a hotel under a different name, something I hadn't done since my early audit days. Old habits resurfaced easily. I ordered room service I didn't eat and sat by the window, watching reflections instead of the street. By morning, I knew one thing for certain: whoever had hired that man wasn't trying to scare me. They were trying to learn me. The next step was obvious. I called Sarah. Sarah Kim had been my attorney for 25 years. She didn't ask why when I requested an off-the-record meeting. We met at a small cafe an hour outside the city, the kind of place people don't choose unless they're trying not to be found. "You're being watched," she said after I told her everything, not as a question. "Yes. And you suspect." "I don't suspect," I interrupted gently. "I want confirmation." Sarah studied me for a long moment. "You don't look surprised." "I'm not. I just didn't expect it to be this direct." She nodded. "I can run background checks." Quietly. "But if someone hired a professional, they likely used layers." "Then peel them," I said. "Carefully." It took 5 days. 5 days of deliberate normalcy. I went to the gym. I answered emails. I walked the same routes. And every now and then, I saw him. Or someone like him. Always at a distance. Always pretending not to look. On the 6th day, Sarah called. "I know who hired him," she said. "And you're not going to like it." I smiled thinly. "I didn't expect to." "It's your former partner. Daniel Hart." The name landed with more weight than I expected. Daniel and I had built the firm together years ago. He was charismatic, ambitious, brilliant in front of a room. I was the one behind the scenes, making sure nothing exploded. When a scandal broke internally, he'd wanted to manage it quietly. I'd insisted on disclosure. We'd parted, professionally. Cordially. Or so I thought. "He's in trouble," Sarah continued. "Serious trouble. Regulatory. Criminal, potentially. And he thinks I'm the solution," I said. "Or the obstacle." I leaned back in my chair. Everything clicked into place. The sudden interest. The surveillance. The quiet pressure. "He wants to know what I know," I said. "And who I've told." "Exactly." I thanked her and hung up. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I smiled. Daniel had always underestimated one thing: patience. He was a sprinter in a world that rewarded marathons. And he'd just made a critical mistake. He'd shown his hand too early. I decided to let him keep watching. Over the next 2 weeks, I fed the watcher a story. Not directly. Indirectly. I made calls in public places. I let fragments of conversations be overheard. I sent emails from old accounts I knew were compromised. Each piece suggested the same thing: that I was considering coming forward with information related to a past compliance cover-up. Not specifics. Just enough to make someone nervous. The watcher became more attentive. More frequent. Then he made his mistake. He approached me. It happened in a bookstore. Quiet aisle. Travel section. He stood beside me as if browsing, his voice low. "You should be careful," he said. "People get hurt when they don't know when to stop." I didn't look at him. "That sounds like a threat." "It's advice." "From whom?" A pause. "From someone who still respects you." I closed the book I hadn't been reading. "Tell your employer this," I said calmly. "If he wants to talk, he knows where to find me. But next time, he should come himself." The man stiffened. Then he walked away. 2 days later, Daniel called. It was the first time he'd spoken to me in over a year. "I hear you've been busy," he said, forcing lightness into his tone. "I hear you've been hiring strangers to follow retirees," I replied. Silence. "Let's meet," he said finally. Like adults. We chose a restaurant neither of us liked. Old habit. Neutral ground. Daniel looked older. Tired. The confidence was still there, but it had cracks now. You're sitting on something, he said without preamble. Something that could destroy people. Only if they deserve it, I replied. You don't have the full picture. I never needed it, I said. I only needed to know where the lines were. You crossed them. His jaw tightened. I protected the company. You protected yourself. He leaned forward. I can make this worth your while. There it is, I said softly. He paused. You've always been principled. I respect that. But principles don't pay legal fees. I'm not the one with legal fees, I replied. Daniel exhaled sharply. You think you're untouchable. No, I said. I think you're predictable. I stood to leave. He reached for my arm, then stopped himself. This isn't over, he said. No, I agreed. It's just beginning. What Daniel didn't know was that while he'd been watching me, I'd been watching everything else. Sarah had coordinated with a federal investigator I trusted. Quietly. Methodically. We documented patterns. Timelines. Financial trails that didn't add up. The Watcher? He talked. Contractors always do. Especially when they realize they're expendable. By the time Daniel realized what was happening, it was too late. The morning the warrants were executed, I was at home, making coffee. The news alert buzzed on my phone like any other. Corporate executive under investigation. Obstruction. Conspiracy. I turned off the screen and went back to my routine. Weeks later, Michael visited me. He looked relieved. You okay? He asked. I am, I said. You? He nodded. I should have spoken up sooner. You spoke up when it mattered. We sat in silence for a while. Funny thing, Michael said eventually. All that effort to watch you, control you. And in the end, they revealed themselves, I finished. He smiled. People ask me now if I was afraid. If it rattled me to know someone was watching, waiting. The truth is, fear only works when you don't understand its source. I spent my career identifying risks before they became disasters. Patterns before they became scandals. And I learned something along the way that applies far beyond boardrooms and courtrooms. When someone is watching you, it's rarely because you're weak. It's because you're dangerous to them. Not with force. With truth. And truth has a way of cutting through layers no amount of money or intimidation can protect. So if you ever feel that sense, that quiet pressure, that feeling that someone is measuring you from the shadows, don't rush to panic. Don't rush to react. Pause. Observe. Because the moment they start watching you is often the moment they've already lost control. They just don't know it yet. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need confrontation. I needed clarity. And once I had it, everything else followed. I still walk the same routes. I still answer emails. I still live my life. Only now, no one is watching. And that tells me everything I need to know. People ask me now if I was afraid. If it rattled me to know someone was watching, waiting. The truth is, fear only works when you don't understand its source. I spent my career identifying risks before they became disasters. Patterns before they became scandals. And I learned something along the way that applies far beyond boardrooms and courtrooms. When someone is watching you, it's rarely because you're weak. It's because you're dangerous to them. Not with force. With truth. And truth has a way of cutting through layers no amount of money or intimidation can protect. So if you ever feel that sense, that quiet pressure, that feeling that someone is measuring you from the shadows, don't rush to panic. Don't rush to react. Pause. Observe. Because the moment they start watching you is often the moment they've already lost control. They just don't know it yet. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need confrontation. I needed clarity. And once I had it, everything else followed. I still walk the same routes. I still answer emails. I still live my life. Only now, no one is watching. And that tells me everything I need to know. For a while after everything settled, I thought the silence would feel like relief. No strange cars lingering too long. No unfamiliar faces pretending not to notice me. No sense of being measured from a distance. But silence has its own weight. It gives you room to think, and thinking has a way of reopening doors you didn't realize you'd closed. I began to notice how deeply the experience had recalibrated me. I double-checked locks I'd never worried about before. I varied my schedule slightly, not out of fear, but out of habit. Once you've confirmed that someone was mapping your life, you never quite go back to moving through the world unconsciously. You don't become paranoid. You become precise. A month after Daniel's arrest, I received a letter. No return address. Typed, not handwritten. 3 sentences. You were right. I should have listened. I'm sorry. I didn't need a signature. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer with other documents I no longer needed but wasn't ready to destroy. Apologies after exposure always come too late to matter, but they still say something important. They confirm that the person always knew the truth. They were just hoping you didn't. Michael called occasionally to check in. Sarah handled the legal cleanup with quiet efficiency. The investigation widened, as these things tend to do. Daniel wasn't the architect he thought he was. He was a node in a larger network of shortcuts, favors, and carefully ignored warnings. Once one thread was pulled, others followed. I wasn't asked to testify publicly. My role remained what it had always been. Observer. Documentarian. The one who notices what others prefer not to see. That suited me. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, I came across a notebook from my early career. Yellowed pages. Handwritten notes from meetings long forgotten. In the margin of one page, I'd written a sentence I didn't remember writing, but instantly recognized as true. Power doesn't fear strength. It fears awareness. I sat with that for a long time. Looking back, the most unsettling part wasn't that Daniel hired someone to watch me. It was how natural it felt to him. How easily he justified it. Not as malice, but as necessity. In his mind, I wasn't a person. I was a variable. A risk to be assessed and managed. That's how exploitation usually begins. Not with hatred, but with abstraction. You stop seeing someone as a human being and start seeing them as a problem to solve. I've thought a lot about the Watcher, too. The man in the gray jacket. He was good at his job. Careful. Efficient. Detached. But even he slipped eventually. They always do. Surveillance creates a false sense of control. The Watcher starts believing they're invisible, untouchable. They forget that observation works both ways. No one ever asks who's watching the Watcher. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a small ethics forum. Nothing publicized. No press. Just a room full of mid-career professionals trying to reconcile ambition with accountability. I didn't tell my story directly. I didn't need to. I spoke instead about patterns. About early warning signs. About how organizations rot not from dramatic failures, but from quiet compromises. During the break, a woman approached me. Early 40s, maybe. Sharp eyes. Nervous energy. I think someone's watching me, she said, almost apologetically. Not literally. I mean, professionally. I studied her for a moment. The hesitation in her voice. The way she'd rehearsed the sentence before saying it. Why do you think that? I asked. Because every time I raise a concern, it gets reframed as concern about me, she said. My judgment. My tone. My stress levels. I nodded. Who benefits if you start doubting yourself? Her eyes widened slightly. That was all she needed. I didn't hear from her again, but I didn't need to. Some conversations aren't meant to continue. They're meant to catalyze. As for me, life settled into a quieter rhythm. Mornings with coffee and the news. Long walks. Occasional consulting calls that I accepted selectively. I learned to enjoy the anonymity I'd once taken for granted. But I also learned something else. Something I hadn't expected. Being watched changes how you understand freedom. Freedom isn't the absence of scrutiny. It's the absence of leverage. The moment someone believes they can control you by observing you, they reveal that they're afraid of what you might do if left alone. Daniel thought knowledge was power. He thought if he could map my movements, my habits, my contacts, he could neutralize me. What he didn't understand was that information without context is just noise. And context was always my specialty. In the end, I didn't expose him out of anger. I exposed him out of inevitability. Systems correct themselves when pressure is applied in the right places. You don't need force. You need patience. Sometimes people ask me what I would have done if I hadn't noticed the signs. If Michael hadn't warned me. If Sarah hadn't dug deeper. The honest answer is uncomfortable. I probably would have been fine. For a while. That's how these things work. The danger isn't immediate. It's incremental. A nudge here. A suggestion there. Someone else slowly taking control of decisions you used to make without thinking. By the time you realize what's happening, you're already framed as unreliable for noticing. That's the trap. And it's why awareness matters more than strength, youth, or authority. I keep that in mind now whenever I hear someone described as difficult, unstable, or confused, especially when those words come from people who stand to gain from that perception. Labels are powerful tools. They shape narratives. They determine who gets believed. The older I get, the more I understand that survival isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the most accurate one. I still attend conferences sometimes. I still walk into rooms full of people who assume they know me. Every now and then, I catch someone watching a little too closely, measuring, assessing. When that happens, I don't tense up. I smile. Because now I know exactly what it means. It means I'm relevant. It means I'm inconvenient. It means I haven't been neutralized. And as long as that's true, I'm exactly where I need to be. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that attention is never random. If someone is watching you, ask yourself why. Ask yourself what you represent to them. Ask yourself what they're afraid you might see. Most people think danger announces itself loudly. It doesn't. It whispers. It observes. It waits. But so can you. And when you do, when you stop reacting and start noticing, something interesting happens. The balance shifts. The watcher becomes the subject. The pressure reverses. You don't have to confront them. You don't have to expose them immediately. You just have to stay awake. Because the moment you understand why someone is watching you is the moment they lose the advantage they thought they had. And that, more than anything else, is what keeps me calm now. Not the absence of threat. But the presence of clarity. Clarity does something else, too. It strips away illusions you didn't even know you were carrying. After the investigation wrapped, I was asked more than once whether I regretted not stepping forward sooner, not forcing a confrontation before things escalated. The question always came from people who believed conflict was the same as resolution. It never is. Conflict is loud. Resolution is quiet. And quiet requires patience most people don't have. What surprised me most wasn't Daniel's actions. It was how many people later admitted they'd sensed something was wrong but said nothing. Former colleagues. Associates. Even one board member who confessed over a drink that he'd noticed Daniel asking unusual questions months earlier. Questions about loyalty. About silence. About who could be trusted if things got complicated. They'd all done what people usually do. They'd told themselves it wasn't their place. That's another uncomfortable truth. Systems don't collapse because of villains alone. They collapse because of spectators. I didn't blame them. Blame is easy. Understanding is harder. Once you've seen how quietly power moves when it thinks no one is paying attention, you start noticing it everywhere. In small offices. In families. In institutions that pride themselves on stability. The tactics are rarely dramatic. They don't need to be. Most people comply long before force is necessary. That's why surveillance is so effective. Not because it gathers information, but because it changes behavior. People soften their words. Delay their decisions. Second-guess instincts they used to trust. Control achieved without resistance feels like cooperation. Daniel never intended to destroy me outright. He intended to manage me. To contain me. To make me cautious enough to stay silent. That distinction matters, because it explains why so many intelligent people fall into similar traps. They don't see the danger until it's framed as concern. Concern is the most convincing disguise control has. Months later, I received a call from an old acquaintance in another industry. We hadn't spoken in years. He sounded hesitant, embarrassed even. "Can I ask you something off the record?" he said. "Of course." "If someone wanted to discredit you quietly," he continued, "what would they do first?" I didn't answer immediately. "They'd question your judgment," I said finally. "Not publicly. Casually. They'd frame it as worry. Stress. Burnout. Anything that sounds sympathetic. And they'd do it before you ever realized you were a threat." There was a long pause on the line. "Thank you," he said softly. We hung up without elaboration. I didn't need to know the details. The pattern was enough. I don't share my story often, and when I do, I'm careful how I tell it. Not because I'm afraid, but because stories like this can be misused. Paranoia helps no one. But awareness? Awareness saves people. There's a difference between being cautious and being closed. I still trust. I still believe most people mean well. But trust, like respect, works best when it's paired with boundaries. One evening, while walking home, I noticed a young man standing across the street, phone in hand, pretending to scroll. For a split second, muscle memory kicked in. I assessed posture. Distance. Exit routes. Then he looked up, smiled awkwardly, and crossed the street in the opposite direction. Nothing. Just coincidence. I laughed quietly at myself and kept walking. That's another thing no one tells you. Once you've been watched, you don't become fearful. You become fluent. You learn the difference between signal and noise. You stop seeing threats everywhere because you've learned what real ones look like. Real threats don't rush. They don't announce themselves. They don't need to. And neither do people who know how to handle them. Daniel eventually took a plea deal. Minimal press coverage. His name faded quickly, as names like his often do. The system absorbed the shock and moved on. It always does. Institutions are excellent at forgetting individuals once they become inconvenient. I never visited him. I didn't need closure in the way movies suggest. Closure is a luxury sold to people who believe answers erase damage. They don't. Understanding does. I understood him. I understood how fear of loss had narrowed his world until ethics felt optional. I understood how success had insulated him from consequences long enough that he mistook entitlement for immunity. And I understood how easy it is, when you're desperate, to convince yourself that watching someone is the same as controlling them. It isn't. Control is fragile. It relies on ignorance. The moment someone understands the game changes. That's the part no one warns you about when they talk about power. Power doesn't disappear when exposed. It inverts. It migrates. It shifts toward whoever is most willing to stay still and see clearly. These days, my life is smaller in the best possible way. Fewer meetings. Fewer explanations. Fewer compromises disguised as necessities. I choose my engagements carefully. I walk away earlier. I listen longer. And when someone leans in close and whispers something meant to unsettle me, I don't tense anymore. I listen. Because whispers are useful. They tell you where fear lives. They tell you who feels watched themselves. And they remind you of something most people forget. The moment someone starts watching you, they've already admitted one thing, whether they realize it or not. They believe you matter. They believe you're capable of changing outcomes. They believe that left alone, you're dangerous to their plans. And once you understand that, once you truly internalize it, you stop asking why it's happening. You start asking how to use it. I never set out to be untouchable. I set out to be accurate. To see what was there instead of what I was being encouraged to believe. That was enough. It always is. So if you ever find yourself in that position, sensing eyes where there shouldn't be any, feeling pressure that doesn't quite make sense, remember this. Don't rush. Don't confront. Don't explain yourself. Observe. Because the quietest moment in any struggle is right before the balance shifts. And if you're calm enough to notice it, you'll know exactly what to do next. Knowing what to do next doesn't always mean acting immediately. Sometimes it means doing nothing at all and letting the world reveal itself to you. After everything that happened, I started receiving invitations I hadn't seen in years. Panels. Advisory boards. Quiet off-the-record consultations. People who had once been cautious around me now seemed oddly eager to reconnect. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Then I recognized it for what it was. People are drawn to those who survive pressure without breaking. They want to know how. They want to know what you saw. They want to know what you're capable of now. I declined most of them. Not out of bitterness, but because discernment is a form of self-respect. I'd spent enough years being useful to systems that only valued me when I was silent. I wasn't interested in repeating that dynamic under a different name. One afternoon, as I was leaving a small meeting downtown, a man approached me in the lobby. Late 50s. Well-dressed, but not ostentatious. The kind of person you might pass a dozen times without remembering. I don't expect you to remember me, he said, extending a hand. We crossed paths briefly, years ago. I shook his hand. You're right. I don't. He smiled. That's probably for the best. We walked together toward the exit. I heard what happened with Hart, he said casually. Unfortunate. Consequences usually are, I replied. He nodded. I wanted to say something then. I didn't. I stopped walking and looked at him. Why are you saying something now? Because I didn't like the feeling of recognizing myself in the people who stayed quiet, he said. And because I thought you should know that not everyone who noticed chose comfort. I studied him for a moment, then nodded once. That was enough. Redemption doesn't always require forgiveness. Sometimes acknowledgement is sufficient. After he left, I stood there longer than necessary, thinking about how many versions of that conversation I'd never have. How many people had watched from a distance, weighing risk against conscience, and chosen silence. I understood them better now. Fear doesn't always look like cowardice. Sometimes it looks like waiting too long. Life has a way of testing the lessons you think you've already learned. About a year later, I was contacted by a former client. Elderly. Wealthy. Sharp in conversation, but clearly tired. His message was brief. Could we talk? Privately. We met in his home. Modest by his standards, immaculate in the way of people who cling to order when other things feel uncertain. As we sat at his kitchen table, he leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. "They say I'm forgetting things," he said. "Little things." I felt something settle into place inside me. "Who says that?" I asked. "My daughter. Her husband. The doctor they recommended." "And do you believe them?" He hesitated. "That's the problem. I'm starting to." I didn't rush him. Silence has weight, and sometimes people need to feel it before they can speak honestly. "They moved some papers," he continued. "Changed where I keep my medication. They say I did it. I don't remember doing it." I met his eyes. "Do you remember not doing it?" "Yes," he said immediately. Then he looked startled by his own certainty. That was all I needed to hear. We spent the next few hours talking. Not about accusations. About patterns. About timelines. About who benefited from what. I asked him to write things down. Dates. Conversations. Small details that felt insignificant. I watched his hands as he wrote. Steady. Controlled. He wasn't confused. He was being managed. When I left that evening, I felt the familiar calm that comes when you recognize a situation clearly. The danger wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was repeating itself, just with different names and a different house. Over the following weeks, I helped him do what I had done. Quietly. Methodically. Without drama. We documented everything. Involved professionals he trusted. Built redundancy into his life so no single person could rewrite his reality. The truth came out on its own. It always does when there's nowhere left to hide it. When it was over, he thanked me in a way that felt heavier than gratitude. "You saved me," he said. I shook my head. "No. You saved yourself. I just reminded you to pay attention." That's when it finally clicked for me. What happened with Daniel wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern. One that thrives on silence, politeness, and the assumption that malice must look dramatic to be real. It doesn't. Most of the time, it looks like concern and patience and someone else slowly rewriting your story. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. These days, I move through the world differently, but not smaller. If anything, my world has become more intentional. I notice who listens when I speak. I notice who reframes my words instead of responding to them. I notice who benefits when doubt enters the room. Those observations don't make me suspicious. They make me free. Freedom isn't about isolation. It's about agency. About knowing that your mind is still your own, your memory's still yours, your judgment intact. And that no one gets to quietly take that from you while smiling. I still hear whispers sometimes. Figurative ones. Subtle ones. Suggestions that maybe it's time to step back, slow down, let others handle things. I consider them carefully. Then I decide. And that, more than anything, is the difference. I don't live in fear of being watched anymore. I live with the understanding that attention follows clarity, and clarity attracts both allies and threats. That's the cost of staying awake in a world that prefers you distracted. If my story has taught me anything, it's this. The most dangerous moment isn't when someone starts watching you. It's when you stop watching yourself. As long as you remain present, observant, and grounded in your own reality, no one else gets to define it for you. And if they try, you'll see it coming. Long before they realize you already have. Seeing it coming changes everything. It doesn't mean you become guarded in every interaction or suspicious of every kindness. It means you stop surrendering your perception to the convenience of other people's narratives. You stop assuming that confusion is always accidental, that concern is always benevolent, that authority is always earned. I've learned to trust one thing above all else: internal consistency. When your memory, your instincts, and the facts you can verify align, doubt doesn't belong to you. It belongs to whoever is trying to introduce it. That lesson has stayed with me. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to that first whisper at the conference. Michael's hand on my sleeve. The calm urgency in his voice. How easily that moment could have been ignored. How tempting it would have been to dismiss it as paranoia, to keep smiling, to keep moving, to tell myself I was imagining patterns that weren't there. Most people do exactly that. Not because they're foolish, but because recognizing danger forces responsibility. Once you see it, you have to decide what kind of person you're going to be. Someone who looks away, or someone who stays present. I chose presence. It cost me relationships I thought were solid. It cost me illusions I didn't realize I was protecting. But it gave me something far more valuable in return, ownership of my own reality. There's a quiet confidence that comes with that. Not arrogance. Not bravado. Just a steady sense that no matter how subtle the pressure, no matter how carefully someone tries to steer you without your consent, you'll notice. And noticing is enough. I still receive messages now and then. People who say my story sounded familiar. People who ask how I knew. When I realized what the exact moment was, I tell them the truth. There was no single moment. There was a feeling. A small one at first. Something that didn't fit. Something I couldn't immediately explain but couldn't ignore either. The moment I stopped trying to explain it away and started observing it, everything changed. That's how these things always begin. Not with certainty. With curiosity. So if you ever find yourself in that space, uncertain but uneasy, don't rush to label it fear. Don't rush to silence it. Sit with it. Watch what happens next. Patterns reveal themselves to those who are patient enough to let them. I don't know what the future holds. None of us do. But I know this. No one gets to quietly dismantle my autonomy. No one gets to rewrite my clarity. No one gets to decide who I am by questioning my mind. If someone ever tries again, they won't need to watch me for long. They'll realize very quickly that I'm already watching back. And this time, I won't need a whisper to know exactly what's happening. The last thing I want to leave you with isn't a warning or a threat or even a lesson in strategy. It's a reminder. Most people think strength looks loud. Assertive. Unyielding. They think survival is about dominance, about pushing back harder than you're pushed. But the truth is quieter than that. Real strength is awareness sustained over time. It's the ability to stay calm while others rush. To stay grounded while others rewrite. To trust yourself when doubt is being gently offered to you as a kindness. It's knowing when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. When I look back now, I don't feel anger toward Daniel or toward the man who watched me or toward the system that allowed it to happen. Anger would mean they still occupy space in my mind. They don't. What I feel instead is resolve. Resolve to remain attentive. Resolve to remain autonomous. Resolve to never outsource my clarity to anyone else's comfort. Life has become simpler in the best possible way. Fewer explanations. Fewer justifications. Fewer situations where silence is mistaken for agreement. I choose my words carefully. I choose my people even more carefully. And when something doesn't sit right, I don't rush past it anymore. I pause. I observe. I let the moment tell me what it needs to tell me. Because the world is always communicating. Not in headlines or dramatic gestures, but in small deviations. In tone shifts. In misplaced concern. In questions that seem harmless but aren't. Once you learn to hear that language, you don't unlearn it. I don't know who might be listening to this story right now and recognizing pieces of their own life in it. Someone who feels subtly managed. Someone whose confidence has been quietly questioned. Someone who's been told, gently and repeatedly, that they might not remember things as clearly as they think they do. If that's you, know this. Your clarity is not a flaw. Your awareness is not arrogance. And your hesitation to accept someone else's version of you is not denial. It's self-preservation. You don't need to confront anyone. You don't need to accuse or expose or explode. You just need to stay awake. Because the moment you stop doubting yourself and start observing others, the balance shifts. The leverage dissolves. The whispers lose their power. And the people who thought they could quietly control you will realize something far too late. They were never watching you to understand you. They were watching you because they were afraid of what you already understood. That's where my story ends. Not with revenge. Not with triumph. But with clarity intact. And that, in the end, is the one thing no one ever gets to take from you unless you give it away.